Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Delta EE webinar on heat as a service. My name is Arthur Joannick. I will be your host for today. In this webinar, we'll be talking about some of the frequently asked questions that we often receive from our clients and contacts in the industry about heat as a service and how to develop this new business model for the industry. I'll be joined by my colleague Rox and by our friend Iain. Hi, boss. Are you here? Everything is working well?
Good morning, Arthur.
Hi, good morning. Just maybe Rox, if you flick to the next slide, some of the rules for the webinar. You can see on the right a screenshot of the software that you are using. You have the opportunity to ask questions directly to us if you want. We will be monitoring them. We will either be responding directly by writing or asking. I'll be asking them to Rox and Iain, and we'll try to answer them. If we don't answer the questions, don't worry. We'll get back to you after the webinar and have a discussion with you if you want. The webinar today is recorded, which means you will be able to watch it later on YouTube and share it with your colleagues if you need. We will also be sending the slides on PDF. And yeah, if after the webinar you want to chat to us, very happy to do so. We might reach out to you as well to see if everything was clear, if you have any questions, or if we ourselves have some questions for you guys. Just to introduce the team, so myself, Arthur, I lead the business development in Delta E across Europe with a particular interest in some topics like the decarbonisation of heat. I have my colleagues Rox on the line. Hi, Rox, how are you?
Morning, Arthur. Well, thanks, and you?
All fine. Can you tell a bit more about what you are doing?
Yeah, sure. So I head up what we call our heating business service, and that is one of our subscription research services. It sits alongside our other heat services on the electrification of heat and gas heating. And in the heating business service, we focus specifically on what's changing, not in terms of what is being sold, but how it's being sold. So new customer propositions, routes to market, sales channels. That's the kind of innovations that we monitor.
Great, thank you, Rox. And we have a special guest today, Iain McKechnie, if I pronounce it correctly. Hi, Iain. Iain actually leads a specialist team within the Advanced Services Group to drive engagement with manufacturers and help companies to embed the research methods, tools, and frameworks into their operations and to assist them in the design of their advanced services. Iain, can you say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, of course, Arthur. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Arthur said, I'm the Director of Strategic Programs within the Advanced Services Group. We're a specialist group within Aston University in Birmingham in the UK. We focus specifically on the term servitization, which is really adding services to support products in use, and the term advanced services, which is really about the specialist and more complex services that you can adopt to provide your customers with much more capability and better value and better outcomes. So I'll explain more as the webinar goes on.
Thank you, Iain. And as if you have not noticed, Iain is from Scotland, according to his accent. Thank you all. Rox, you can move on to the next slide, please. So just as an introduction to the topic of today, there are lots of things happening today in the energy markets. And particularly, we feel that everything is accelerating since the start of the COVID crisis and the recovery packages. But just to list a few things that we believe are big trends in helping the markets towards energy and heat as a service. First one being obviously the targets for lowering carbon emissions from heating across Europe, which sometimes means electrification of heat in some countries or other types of technologies. But often these technologies are much more expensive than a traditional gas boiler or electric heating system, which means things have to be done in order to help customers afford these sort of systems. We also have the growth of the solar PV and energy storage markets across Europe as the products get cheaper and governments are pushing for these technologies. How can we not talk about EV charging with the huge exponential growth of electric vehicles in Europe, and how customers are actually charging their vehicles has a huge impact on energy management within the home and buildings, which obviously impacts how heating is being done. Governments are also providing a lot of regulatory changes to help decarbonize heat and energy. That can be seen through new regulations in the new build sector. It can be seen through policies and incentives for replacing your old inefficient heating systems and more. Obviously, we have home services, which are becoming more and more interesting for companies in order to have more recurring revenues and more profitable businesses. There are some technological advances like smart meters and connected controls who have a more and more important place a more important role to play in the energy markets as the rollout of these technologies is growing. Some customers now have access to time of use and dynamic electricity prices, which means a lot more can be done in order to help them save on their bill. The electricity networks have increasing need from services, for example, demand response and flexibility, which again, heating can play a big part in. And as I said, the customer budgets are not necessarily evolving very fast either, which means all of this can only be afforded at scale if some business models are evolving. And this is why we strongly believe that heat as a service has a major role to play in the energy transition today. And we'll be explaining a bit how we think this can be done. Rox, if you move on to the next slide, this would be a reminder of our last webinar we presented last year around framing heat as a service and the way we think about it. You can see on the diagram 5 different risks that we're talking about. So when a company, for example, offers heat as a service to customers through leasing of the heating system, but first of all, the company is taking a financial risk. So what happens if the customer doesn't pay, for example? What can you do about it, etc. When you lease or rent heating system, there are technical challenges. So if something breaks up, if there is a problem with the heating system, you are responsible for repairing it and even identifying it. And therefore, when you provide this, you need to ensure that this is working really well. Related to some of the business models, some companies are offering heat as a service as an outcome of heat. So let's say we offer you as a customer X number of kilowatt hours per year as the outcome of the heating system. Well, you kind of need to ensure that the heating system works properly. Otherwise, you will end up paying a lot more than you should. So you have to ensure that the system is working very efficiently. And how do you handle customer behavior? So what if I'm offering a fixed tariff for heating and the customer opens the windows in winter? How do you deal with this? How do you manage the risk? And finally, some of the companies are offering the whole package, including electricity or gas, which means you are taking a risk on the evolving energy prices depending on the length of your contract. So that's kind of a big risk as well that some companies are taking today. And there is one more risk we identify, which is around regulations and regulatory environments, particularly in some countries. So what happens if the customer doesn't want the heating system anymore or doesn't pay? Are you allowed even to these sort of business models? So these are the sort of things that we are constantly analyzing around the business model of heat as a service. And there is a YouTube link here on the slide to remind you if you want a bit more details on this analysis. And as you can see, compared to last year, a lot more companies are actually offering this sort of business model, which is really encouraging for the growth of this market. So we are really thrilled to see so many names moving into this market and believing this is the way to grow the decarbonization of heat, as well as increasing their margins and their revenues. We have a question actually from Nicola before we move on. So do you think electrification of heat is a requirement for heat as a service? It's a good question. Actually, a lot of these companies are doing it through gas boilers initially, mostly to prove the business model, because a heat pump is 3 to 5 times more expensive than the boiler. Therefore, the risks are a bit higher. We do believe the final end for heat as a service is more likely to be around electrification of heat. But for now, we are in a transition phase where most of these business models are based on gas heating. So in terms of the discussion in the webinar, we'll be talking about 5 key questions that we receive from clients and industry. What are the commercial benefits from doing it as a service? So do you actually make money from it? Or are there anything else that you benefit from? How can the supply chain deliver heat as a service, from the manufacturing to all the intermediates, to the installer, the maintenance company, the customer? How do you finance heat as a service as well? So do you need financing partners? Can you do it yourself? What risk are you taking around this? And then, as I said, what if customers are actually stopping to pay for heat as a service? What can you do about this? And finally, a bit more around the future of heat as a service. What's our views on the likely take-up of services, and particularly heat as a service, over the next few years and over the next decade? So, Rox, after you on the first question, what are the commercial benefits from heat as a service?
Thanks, Arthur. So to answer this question, I've drawn up 2 theoretical scenarios of how the total costs and revenues of delivering heat to customers add up over about a 10-year period. And in the product scenario on the left, you've got customers paying upfront for the appliance installation and then separately for the energy use and maintenance thereafter. Whereas in the service scenario on the right, the appliance installation is funded by the finance provider, so that there's no upfront cost to the customer, and instead they just pay for everything together in a single monthly fee. And the first way that, in theory, service providers can increase revenue is by selling more products, since you're removing that upfront cost, which for some customers might have been prohibitive. And this is actually one of the benefits that you see manufacturers emphasizing to their installer partners. They say, offer our service package with no upfront cost, and you'll be able to convert more customers. The second way that service providers can increase revenue is then by reducing operational costs. And over the product lifetime, the biggest opportunities for cost savings are actually on energy supply. So here you can do things like selling a more efficient appliance up front, which might have cost more, but because you're paying for it in a monthly fee, you can do that, and ultimately will hopefully pay back over the contract lifetime. You could maybe also install energy saving measures like topping up insulation, simple things like that. Optimizing the operation of the appliance based on energy costs if you're following wholesale energy prices, and also obviously just sourcing the electricity or gas as cost effectively as possible. You can obviously see that there is the big additional cost of finance on the service side, which in reality actually usually makes these service contracts more expensive today. But ideally that will be then compensated for by the operational cost savings, so that you've got more customers, higher revenues, higher profits, lower energy consumption, and then some of those cost savings being shared with customers so that they also pay less overall.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Thanks, Rox. Now, one of the things that I'd like to pick up on is about the actual commercial benefits that we see in industry. But before I do that, really worthwhile just starting with the book Made to Serve there that you can see. That was written by Professor Tim Baines, and Tim's the #1 cited academic in the world for the term servitization and advanced services. And when Tim put the book together, he focused on 5 large OEM firms across a number of different sectors. Rolls-Royce was included, Alstom, Xerox. One in particular was MAN Truck and Bus. And the reason Tim started to investigate these firms was that they were all generating in excess of 50% of their revenues through services. And when we drilled down behind the research that sat within the MAN Truck and Bus case study, we identified that when they were just selling the truck, they were generating somewhere in the region of 3% margin. When they were looking at the truck and the services to support the uptime on the road, then the margins were nearer the 30% mark. So a significant uplift in terms of margin potential and therefore the commercial benefits. Now, there are infrastructure costs that need to be absorbed to be able to deliver these services to support the truck in use, but it's just an example of the way that you can start to unlock new value in that relationship with the customer as you get closer to them. Now, although we're talking about heating as a service today, all of the work that we are involved in at the Advanced Services Group is really all about business models. So I could be talking about cooling as a service, as we did previously with some colleagues from CARE in Singapore. It could be rice milling as a service. So the examples on the right-hand side there came from the two books that you can see, the Servitization Applied in the green and the blue format. And the case studies, we identified £10 million of new revenues purely from 30 companies alone, where they were able to add new services to support the products. And one in particular, Cool Mill Systems, they are the manufacturer of rice milling machines. And they're looking at putting rice milling machines into China to allow villages to manage their own rice production systems. There are significant benefits commercially. There's energy reduction in terms of the consumption, the power. There's the utility of the machine itself. It is mobile. It can be moved from village to town to village. It's much smaller footprint. And all of these things considered have to be built into a business model that allow them to operate that effectively. So there are huge commercial benefits in moving along this model. And I think I'm happy more, obviously at the end, to take more questions about what it might mean to your particular sector. But just as an example, some of the companies there you can see were involved in 3D scanning. Some were involved in data storage as a service. Some were providing a glass factory where they were providing machining as a service. So there are commercial benefits for a whole range of companies of different sizes, different sectors, different geographies, different maturities. But the thing starts with understanding the business model in use and how you can make your customer more successful. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, Rox, then second question for us. How can supply chains deliver everything we're talking about? It seems like it's a nice idea, but in reality, how does that work?
Yeah, so in our last webinar, we showed this diagram of how the customer has a relationship with only one service provider instead of a whole range of actors, as is the case today. And the kind of questions we got from manufacturers then are, well, how does this change our relationship with heating engineers? Will merchants still play a role? What relationship am I going to have with the service provider, or should I be the service provider myself, like in this case over here? And the way we see it is that there's kind of a spectrum of strategic options for a manufacturer, and the way the supply chain looks will then ultimately depend on which option you go with. So on the B2B side in blue, at the furthest end of the spectrum for a manufacturer is simply providing a white label appliance to a service provider who wants their logo on the appliance. So this is like the Mondo's T1 range in Germany made by Intergas, or NG's boiler that they offer in France that's made by Cosmic Gas. The next option along is just having partnerships with various service providers so that they sell your appliances and you're active in that channel. And this is the approach that is taken by most manufacturers today. It doesn't really change their business model or supply chain that much. It just means that they need to have partnerships with the relevant players. One step further than that is providing both your appliance and additional services to the service provider, like an extended warranty maybe, or like maintenance services and analytics. And that's kind of what you see manufacturers like Niva offering with their uplink service to providers like enero in the Netherlands. And then alternatively, on the orange B2C side of the spectrum, manufacturers could then, of course, themselves become service providers. This is less common than B2B options, but we've seen more and more manufacturers launching these kind of service offers in the last few years. And that's when you've got to have a whole lot of new capabilities that you didn't have before, and whether that's through partnerships or bringing those capabilities in-house yourself. These are mostly product as a service today. This is things like NAFIT's boiler or heat pump rentals in the Netherlands, and they're working with their existing installer partners to offer that service. But then there are also manufacturers offering energy supply too, like Viessmann in Germany, where you're allowed to use district heating contracts for individual systems, so that non-energy suppliers are allowed to do the metering and billing, and that then requires them to have those kind of capabilities in-house, which they might have not had before. And as to which strategic approach is best, it doesn't necessarily have to be just one of these options. So a single manufacturer might take multiple approaches across different countries, or even within a single country, you might be going through all these different channels. And how you decide on the right approach depends on a lot of factors, like what are your market shares, the market structures, what do customers want, regulations, how much budget you're willing to put towards the project of developing this, and also what kind of capabilities you can easily access in that country. So usually you'll see manufacturers testing B2C propositions in one market first. Sometimes it's their home market, other times it's a smaller kind of lower risk market. And then if it's successful, then maybe expanding and adapting that model in other countries.
Rox, have we seen any particular successful example out of this model? Like what do we see is the trend today in the biggest countries or in Europe, or is there anything that particularly jumps out for you that works really well?
So manufacturers are doing pretty well with the product as a service model. So a kind of like appliance leasing or appliance rental model, which doesn't necessarily include energy supply, which is not too hard to offer, because you can, if you pitch it correctly, you can get installers on board, and if you price it correctly, you can attract quite a lot of customers. So from a manufacturer point of view, we're seeing manufacturers getting pretty good sales with these types of models that they're launching. Similarly for energy suppliers, when they're launching these types of models, they've already got access to like millions of customers. So they're seeing, a quarter or upwards of their sales being rental or leasing models. Customer interest in energy supply is a bit more limited. Like it's a kind of 50-50 split on whether people want to include energy supply, but certainly the pay monthly for the appliance seems to be attractive to customers.
Okay, it's really interesting to see that manufacturers start, as you said, to get a lot of sales through this product as a service model, because when these kind of companies start to make margins on products and services, then they will quickly try to scale up. So I think we can expect a lot more of this push from the top manufacturers in Europe, and the market is likely to grow on all the parts of the supply chain. So that makes it quite an interesting thing. Thank you.
Yeah,
Rox.
absolutely.
Okay, so thank you, Rox. On this slide, I'm going to extend that slightly to frame it in a servitization context. So normally what we see from a manufacturing perspective are three levels, and they're represented there by the orange and the lilac and the blue. And we look at them from a base, intermediate and advanced service perspective. So for the manufacturers that are on the webinar this morning, you will perhaps be able to align yourself with one of these segments in terms of whether you just supply products or you supply the product and spares for the product. Some of you may go up into the purple area, where you perhaps with sensors on your product are able to adopt a performance advisory position, where you're guiding the capture of more value from the product because you understand the way that the customer is using it, or from your inherent manufacturing product specialist knowledge, you can help them find ways of using the product to give them more advantage. But as we go up into the top blue area, where we focus much more on capability, this is the advanced services area. And it's worth being mindful of the fact that there are different levels as you go up into this advanced service point. You can guarantee the outcome from the asset, so you can focus purely on the asset or the product, and you can guarantee the outcome from that through contracting. But there are obviously greater benefits to be extending that intimacy with your customer and moving up into the process capability area. So that's when you're starting to tie the product to the systems, so that you're understanding the data and the feedback loops, and how you can perhaps streamline and take some of the pain away from the way that the customer is delivering that service ultimately to their customer. And our holy grail, if you like, is getting up into the ecosystem level, where you're guaranteeing the outcome from the platform as a wider capability. So you're looking after much more of your customers' areas of interest in terms of the product, the processes, and the ecosystem. Now, also worthwhile being aware of, this feels very one-dimensional, i.e. we're looking from a manufacturer perspective towards a customer. You can also have supply chains providing these base, intermediate, and advanced services to you as a customer yourself. So one of the things that we do is we spend a lot of time investigating value networks. So research by one of my colleagues, Dr. Kawal Kapoor, is looking at value networks at the moment and developing a mini guide where we're going to be able to help companies understand how to identify the value in not only the supply chain, but in the immediate area around about the supply chain, to find other ways of delivering that capability, either more effectively or with fewer raw materials or energy consumption considerations. So I think the framework's there. Obviously happy to take questions at the end on the framework of anything around that. Thanks, Arthur.
Actually, Iain, we have actually 2 or 3 questions related to the top part of your graph. Do you have any sort of B2C examples related to this more advanced capability offers that are in the market?
In terms of energy or in generic?
Ideally energy, obviously, but a generic would be quite helpful to illustrate what we're talking about.
Okay, so one of the research projects we're involved in involves Baxi, and we're working with Baxi to develop a servitization demonstrator, or a digital servitization demonstrator, where we will be helping Baxi to understand how all of these advanced services connect, so that they can provide either the boiler or the heat pump, not only as an asset, but then tie in the processes around that to provide the warmth in either the local authority, the local housing, ultimately the end customer in a domestic dwelling, where they are only really interested in warmth as a service. But to be able to do that, you need to understand the landscape that you're working in and the capabilities that you are able to deliver, but also that your customers require. So from Baxi's perspective, what they're looking at is tying all of these things together with our research to see how they can design a model that allows them to deliver heat as a service to multiple customers in both B2B and B2C environments. So it's early days yet. We have more examples from perhaps non-energy sectors, because we've started much more from a manufacturing position, but these are becoming much more common now and evolving as we go through our research.
Thank you very much, Iain. Moving on next, so talking about the financing side of things, how are you two feeling this is happening for heat as a service? Rox, maybe I think you go first.
Sorry, I was muted. So usually with the financing, the ownership of the appliance is assumed by an independent financial leasing company, and this is if it's an appliance rental or lease, not if it's just finance plus a maintenance contract. But sometimes you also have a financial business unit within the manufacturer's corporation that assumes ownership. So if you look, more broadly at the different potential sources of finance, you've got retained revenue, and you'll maybe use this at an innovation or R&D stage, but generally not for a commercial offering. There is also equity, for example, from investment funds, and we've seen Econic in the Netherlands attracting sustainable investment funds with their heat pump rentals, which they kind of brand as sustainability as a service. But the most common source of finance is just through debt. So some banks will finance it, but more often it's a bank-owned leasing company or an independent leasing company. So BNP Paribas is an example. They finance NG software in France. You also get in-house leasing companies, like I mentioned. So you've got Siemens Financial Services as an example. And then another potential option is corporate bonds. And I say this because we recently saw Eon successfully issue green bonds at incredibly low interest rates. They won't necessarily use that for funding services, but it is something I wanted to highlight as a potential source of low-cost finance. And then there's even crowdfunding. So last year we saw Thermondo launching a crowdfunding offer offering 6% returns to partially finance their appliance leasing, but the bulk of the finance is then provided by their partner bank.
Okay, and in terms of my response from a research perspective, we've identified through some work done by Dr. Ali Bigdeli and Professor Tim Baines, looking at 6 different types of revenue models that are appropriate for the delivery of these advanced services. And there are 2 fixed payment types, there are 3 variable types, and there's a hybrid type. Now, I've used Roxanne's model from her earlier slide just to give you an example of how that might play out in practice around about heating as a service. So if you look at the first column there, type 1, which is a flat fee-based type model, this is really about providing just heat, and you might find that you've got £64 per month over a flat 12-month period. So just a total annual cost divided by 12, very simple. If you go to a profile-based model, type 2, then you might find that each quarter is different because the typical heat consumed is different. So you have, obviously in the UK, a seasonality effect. So in quarter 1, you might be coming out of winter where your costs are higher and you're using heating for longer during a day and at perhaps higher temperatures. But then as you move into the spring and the summer months, you find that your typical heat consumed reduces, and therefore so do your costs. And then as we move into some of the variable type payments, the 3 main things to be aware of here is that we're looking at the usage type, we're looking at an output type, and we're looking at an outcome type. And for that type 3, the usage-based one, you might enter into a contract to pay your heat provider so much per hour for the distribution costs and perhaps so much per hour for the platform costs. So you're really just paying for the actual costs sitting behind the scenes and delivering the heat. If you move to the output-based model, it might be that you want to pay for the temperature that you feel most comfortable with. So you might want to enter into a contract that says, well, I want to pay for 18 degrees centigrade and I will pay X for that. Or I might want to be much more comfortable and pay for 20 degrees and 22 degrees, etc. So again, you're paying for the output that you're receiving from your provider of that heating as a service. But as you move into outcome-based model type 5, in here I've included the cost of the product and service so that it was very comparable with Roxanne's model. But what you're actually seeing here is perhaps a share of the profits of the reducing energy costs in allowing your provider to provide the heat as a full system. So they take responsibility for the provision of the heat pump or the boiler, the infrastructure, And what you're then paying for is just warmth, which is the outcome that you're looking for. And the research identified, obviously, a sixth type, which was a hybrid-based model, where you might find that you're paying a flat fee for just the heat provision, but then you might also be paying a different fee for the energy levels consumed. So again, there are different types depending on the customer-supplier relationship, the sector, the context. But it's also worthwhile being aware that as you move into these outcome-based contracts, there are other penalties and incentives that you need to consider. So if you move into the next slide, please, Rox. You've then got a model where on the lower half of the screen, you might have a lower value asset. So in a regular, perhaps B2C environment, you're providing the maintenance and the management services, and in return, you're getting the heat as a customer, and you make a periodic payment for that service, minus any penalties in terms of the manufacturer failing to perform. So downtime might be a very good example there. But you've also got perhaps compensation due to the provider because you have not used the equipment or the heat or the service as agreed in the original contract. As you look at the top half of the screen, I've tried to illustrate that by looking at a higher value asset. So this might be, if we took Rolls-Royce example, an engine on a wing, it might be $10 million for the asset. So you can see that rather than the customer paying 10 million or 100 million for the plane just to have the ability to fly, then you've got this third sector that happens where there's a financial partner starts coming into the mix to allow that high value asset and service to be provided to the customer, and the customer pays for that payment of the asset or the service or the capability back into a finance partner. And that finance partner pays the manufacturer at the starting point. So the thing that we're noticing there is that we are seeing more and more appetite for some of these financial services coming in, and it may be that companies are digging into the reserves to actually fund that interaction themselves rather than forcing or expecting their customers to go to a finance house or a bank directly. But we're also seeing companies setting up their own financial firms as adjuncts to the core manufacturing capability, and they are then the lending finance partner to make sure that everything works properly. So again, we are seeing more and more of a move to this finance partner. Big benefit of that is that it allows the customer to get more or less immediate access to the asset and the capability without having to find all of the money to make that capital purchase. Thanks, Rox.
Thank you very much, Ian. We actually have a lot of questions coming in, so we are very conscious of time and we'll have to filter a little bit, but maybe Rox, a question for you. We have a few questions around how to measure either the consumption or the warmth or things like that. How does that actually work for the customer's perspective for the measure of heat, actually?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to use an example here of enero in the Netherlands. They're trialing offering comfort as a service, they call it, to social housing tenants. And what they've done there is they've installed heat pumps in new build properties. Alongside those heat pumps, they've installed a separate electricity meter so they can meter the electricity consumption of the heat pump and still allow the customer to have a separate energy supplier for their other electricity. And then the way they define comfort in that model is 20 degrees Celsius in the winter months, so measuring warmth on a degree Celsius basis, and then also guaranteeing 180 liters of hot water a day. So providing a metric to both the space heating and the water heating. Behind that, in the contract, they also have an upper limit of a certain number of gigajoules of energy use over the entire year. And if the customer exceeds that, then they'll negotiate perhaps a slightly higher price because it turns out the customers are wanting higher temperatures. And by doing that, they then do allow the customer to flex up and down a couple of degrees on that 20 degrees. So it's not a very strict 20 degrees, but as long as they don't consume over a certain amount over the year. And then I should also mention that for models where they're metering heat output, because they're using district heating regulations for their model, then it's with a heat meter that gets installed alongside the appliance. And actually that adds cost. So that's one of the issues with these models, is the installation of all these additional meters then makes it more expensive than just installing an appliance in a normal way. And it's one of the things, one of the kind of challenges that we need to overcome to make these models more attractive to customers.
Great. Thank you very much, Rox, for the comprehensive answer. Let's move on to the next question, which is, if you flick to the next slide, Rox, is a question around customers. And obviously, I mean, we had questions also in the question box around, customers staying on average for 7 years in their homes. Why are the contracts lengths around 10 years? But we also have questions around why customers would continue to pay and what happens if customers don't pay. So do we have some early answers around what happens when they stop paying for that?
Yeah, so this is definitely my number one most frequently asked question is, what if customers stop paying for no apparent reason? Can I recover the asset? Can I reuse it? Or what if they stop paying for a legitimate reason, like they've moved out the property? So ideally, you want to mitigate this risk as far as possible at the contract design stage. And you can do that potentially by maybe working only with certain types of customers. So the example I gave of enero, they're trialing comfort as a service with social housing associations rather than private homeowners. You could also go for shorter contract lengths, so you recover your costs quicker. Though this does then limit your opportunity to make savings on the running costs in the longer term. So somebody had asked a question about if people only stay in their properties for 7 years, why would you offer a 10-year contract? It doesn't need to be 10 years, it can be 5 years. And in fact, 5 years is attractive to a lot more customers. It actually depends on the country as to what people choose. So the UK, for example, is a country where people want shorter contracts. UK and Italy actually sort of 2 to 5 years. Whereas countries where people expect their systems to last in excess of 20 years, like Germany, then people are more inclined to go for longer contracts. And in the event that people do move house, the contract providers usually just allow the contract to be transferred to a new homeowner, or for the balance of the contract to be paid out so that there's no remaining liability. Anyway, coming back to this at the contract stage, you could also ask for a deposit or some portion of the cost to be paid up front. You can offer insurance against non-payment as part of the monthly fee, and that's what Engie does in France. But ultimately, you do also just need to price in an assumed default rate. Then at the execution stage, as I mentioned, you'll try, if you can, to transfer the contract. So sometimes if a customer stops paying unexpectedly, you might find that the ownership of the building then transfers hands, and you can try and get the new owner to take on the contract. Less ideal is actually reducing service provision, so like dropping the room temperature to 16 degrees or stopping provision completely. But Arthur, as you mentioned in the beginning, there's often regulations that don't allow you to leave a customer without heat. But in some countries, it is actually possible to physically remove the asset. So Aston does this with their boiler rentals in the Netherlands when the customer ends the contract. This obviously also adds costs. So if you can find, it's something you wouldn't really do unless you can find a way to make it economical by reusing the appliance or something like that.
Okay, and the example I've got here on the screen in front of you came from a project called Next Generation Rice Milling that we were invited to participate in to help with the business model, the revenue model, and the contract model. And basically, Dr. Paraksit Naik did some fantastic work on identifying 3 different levels of contracting, and these in themselves help mitigate against any potential risk or outcome if the customer stops paying. So without getting into too much detail, you've got 3 levels. You've got the basic clause, which is really just about having the structure in place to make it happen. You've got the schedules, where that looks at the detail and actually what you're going to provide and the performance parameters around that provision of the service. And the risk mitigation clauses, that's really where all the responsibilities and liabilities and rewards sit. But one of the things I would say is that you really, by taking a business model, advanced service business model approach, you tend to find that the contract is not something you want to use as a tool. It's there as a reminder of the mechanisms that you've agreed. But by understanding the customer pain and what you can provide as a capability to a customer, you can negotiate and build the business model. So you're looking at the actual, the value proposition itself, then identifying how you're going to deliver the value, how you're going to get paid for the value, and the commercial advantage that you will give your customer or end user. So in recognizing that, if you go through the right steps to deliver the advanced service proposition, the contract tends to be something that sits in the background and you don't really want to be using it. If you do have to use it, everything is nice and clear and set out about how you will deal with it. But there are simple ways to deal with the issue of the customer stop paying. Thanks, Rox.
Thank you, Ian. And final question to share with our audience is, as we say, we strongly believe that this business model will enable sort of the energy transition to happen. But what is actually the outlook? What is our view on what's likely to happen in the next year, the next 5, next 10 years around this business model and the comparison with the traditional model? Rox, what's your feeling around this? What is our research saying about the future outlook?
So, I mean, we've done research both with customers and obviously with service providers and prospective service providers themselves. And on the demand side, I would say that from our customer research across Europe, homeowners really do like the idea of a heating subscription. So we did a survey where 60% of people said they found this concept appealing, which would suggest uptake rates of around 15%, depending on the pricing. Appeal is one thing, obviously, but you also want to know whether customers would choose this option ahead of other alternatives. So that's something we asked in our most recent survey. And here you can see that almost 20% of homeowners said that they would choose an appliance rental rather than paying upfront or on finance. And this might not seem like a huge percentage, but it's way higher than current uptake. So I think there's definitely untapped opportunity from customers. But looking at the supply side, I don't think we'll quite reach this level in the next decade, simply because prospective service providers themselves are still a bit hesitant about developing offers, and when they eventually do, it will take some time to market and grow these. So I think we could reasonably expect to see up to 10% of heating appliances being sold on service contracts by the end of the decade. Some countries that will be more and others a bit less. Today, they're most established in the Netherlands, where nearly 10% of boilers are sold on rental contracts. Germany's catching up. There's more and more boilers being sold on leasing contracts there. But of course, in future, we expect more of these rental or leasing models to be for heat pumps as the market grows and customers look to avoid those higher upfront costs. And that's both in retrofit and new build. So Econica, I mentioned earlier, they're actually working with building developers in the Netherlands to install heat pumps in new builds that the tenants then pay for on a monthly basis. So it's not a model that's limited to retrofits. And then in terms of who's actually offering this, as I said, today it's mostly energy suppliers. They've got the best access to customers, but there are also some heating specialists like Thermondo and HVAC manufacturers also active here. But I think we'll see the most growth in kind of 5 to 10 years coming from HVAC manufacturers as more and more look to move from being maybe a B2B partner for energy suppliers or heating specialists to instead developing their own B2C offerings.
Yeah, and I guess ROCs, as you said, given the heat pump market is likely to grow quite fast in the next few years, the model is likely to be more adapted to this kind of technology. And given the heat pump market is led by a lot of the non-European based manufacturers, you can expect a lot of them to start moving into the space in order to gain market shares or grow their business. And that would be a particularly interesting battle moving forward.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and in this slide, what I'd like to do is draw your attention to the graphic in the center of the slide, which is the Advanced Services Transformation Roadmap. This was developed over a number of years by Professor Tim Baines, Dr. Ali Bigdeli, Dr. Andy Schroeder, and other academic colleagues at the Advanced Services Group. And what it was doing was it was understanding where large firms were on their transformation journey. So if we move from left to right, what we found was that many companies were in the exploration stage. They were uncertain about servitization and advanced services. What might it mean to me? Can I make money from it? Some of the typical questions that we'd received. As they become a bit more aware of servitization, then you find that companies move into this engagement stage where it's really about getting board level approval or senior management approval to explore in a bit more detail and to start looking at how some of the customers might react to different business models, how might you get paid for it, what systems might need to change in order to be able to deliver that capability that the customer is looking for example, heating as a service. Not a huge amount of, well, what's the best way to describe it? We find that of the 350 firms that we've worked with so far, most tend to be in areas 1 and 2 on the left-hand side of the diagram. But there are some firms gaining traction and going through phases 3, which is all about the expansion. So this is where they start with a pilot project with a customer, understand the key performance indicators and the results coming back, and then look to scale and expand their offer within either a particular customer segment or market. And then you get into, finally, the exploitation phase. And this is all about positive exploitation. This is about you and your customer becoming much more successful. And in heating as a service, that is about maintaining a level of warmth, but it's also about using fewer raw materials to be able to deliver that warmth, whether that's through innovation within product, whether it's in innovation through services or innovation through the way that you finance it. But taken as a whole, that is the journey that firms tend to go on. You'll also notice on that diagram that there are 4 external markers. On the top of the diagram, there's market-centric forces, and that's where your customers are looking for you to do more for them. You've got the bottom is technology-centric forces, and that's where we see things like Internet of Things and sensor technologies coming more to the fore, where you're putting the capability of data transfer onto the product to understand the product in use, and therefore looking at ways you can create and deliver more value. And on the left-hand side, it's really about the organizational readiness and the ability of the organization to deliver and manage these services. And on the right-hand side, it's about the value networks and understanding who else you can work with to deliver more value to your ultimate end customer, whether that's in a B2B or a B2C environment. The other 2 diagrams that I'm showing there, the top right-hand side is about the advanced service business model, and the quadrant there normally starts up top left, where you're looking at the value proposition. And in our work with firms, we tend to spend about 60% of our time helping them in the value proposition phase, making sure that they have designed the value proposition to meet the customer need and what they can deliver. And in the top right-hand side is all about the value creation and delivery system. Do you have the right skills, people, technologies, platforms, etc., to be able to deliver that value to the customer? Bottom left is really the value capture process. How will you be paid for it, and when will you be paid for it? And that really means making sure that the top half of the model is in place before you do so. And ultimately, at the bottom right-hand side is the competitive advantage. And I would say in the last three boxes there, I tend to spend about 10% of my time. And the remaining 10% is all about bringing these four elements together as a story and using some of the storytelling research that we've got from Dr. Dan Andrews to allow firms to articulate what the value proposition is to the customer. And in the bottom right-hand side there, you'll see I've highlighted the draft advanced service business model blueprint that we're using with firms, and this is something that Baxi are working with us on to allow us to capture these four elements of the quadrant, to tie it in a way that allows communication with colleagues and with internal systems and processes and with the customers and the external environment, to be able to articulate what the value proposition is and how the business model will be able to deliver more value and ultimately support activities such as heating as a service. So back to you, Rox.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Rox. And we're approaching the end of this webinar. Just a few words to say that we are still very active on talking publicly about this topic of heat as a service. You can see a few examples of podcast episodes that we have released in the last year or so on heat as a service. I encourage you to look at it on Spotify and other streaming applications. Rox, if you move on to the next slide, you will see all the steps we have done recently on heat as a service. So as Rox described, we have a dedicated research stream around this called the Heating Business Service. And we have done a few studies and databases recently that might be of interest, one of which is the market status and outlook towards 2025 and 30 for the leading European markets. So our views on how this market is going to evolve based on the competition, based on the regulatory environment, customer uptake, etc. We have a big database capturing a lot of the heating propositions that are happening across Europe. A lot of these are actually heating as a service business models, and you can see all the details on customer numbers, business models, financials, etc. All the things you really need to know about who is doing what and what to learn from them actually. And finally, as Rob explained, we do a lot of research around customers and their behaviors towards heat as a service. So how likely they are to take some things, what are the barriers, what do they think, etc. And one final word to say that around in Delta E, we cover a lot of the work towards the energy transition. So as I mentioned in the first few slides, heat is not something to look at on its own. It's really influenced also by a lot of things happening outside this market, everything related to digital, to the changes in the electricity system with flexibility and storage, with a link to EV charging, with new business models, etc. So there are a lot of work that we are doing around this space that also helps you understand the context for the transition toward a lower carbon heating environments. So that's all for us. Thank you a lot, Rox. Thank you, Ian, for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded, so we will share with you the link available on YouTube afterwards. We can send you the slides as well if you want. For those of you who have asked questions and we haven't answered yet, we will do this afterward by mail or by calling you. Yeah, thank you very much for attending, for taking the time. We know schedules can be quite busy, so we appreciate this, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you very much, Rox. Thank you, Ian, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.